Hello everyone, welcome to mini lecture number 1 for research methods in psychology. In this session we're going to be looking at research in psychology, introducing some of the ideas about research design and key concepts. So by the end of this session you should be able to get a sense of the importance of the role of research in psychology. You should be familiar with some of the key foundational concepts and terms used in psychological research, and you should be able to describe the differences between quantitative and qualitative approaches to research. So one of the first things, and I think when you look at any textbooks in psychology, one of the issues is a belief that psychology is just common sense. So why do we need to bother with research? Why can't we just use our common sense or intuition or just guess at what's going on? And there are a number of answers to this, in that you may have two very conflicting common sense ideas of a phenomenon, and you need a way of choosing between them, for example. But primarily, psychology is an evidence-informed discipline. So psychologists use theory about how the world works, why particular phenomena occur, how they occur. So we use theory, we use research questions to guide us in answering new questions, exploring different aspects of theory, and we use hypotheses, which are testable and precise statements of a relationship that we believe to exist between variables, and we use these to help us identify the most effective approach to, for example, therapeutic treatment or interventions of other forms. So psychology is evidence informed, and part of that evidence has to come from research and good quality research. So the role of research in psychology is shaped by a number of factors. One of those is what a researcher believes can be known about a world, which is called ontology. A researcher's belief about how this should be known or how it can be known, which is related to epistemology, and the value systems and ethical principles to which a researcher ascribes, which is called axiology. So these three things really come together to shape a worldview, and that will guide the types of research design, the types of approaches to research that a researcher uses. And one of the biggest kind of divisions then within research is that of quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. And I've put in brackets there the mixed approach, and you'll see later on in this section that that's being considered as the third worldview, a new emerging and developing approach to research which combines quantitative and qualitative approaches. So we've mentioned some of the things that relate to a quantitative, choosing quantitative and qualitative approaches. Let's try and pin that down a bit further. So some researchers argue that there's a hierarchy of research concepts that will guide the types of questions a researcher asks and how they go about answering that. One of those we've already mentioned is a worldview, and that's shaped by epistemology, ontology and axiology. And that's also known, or more formally usually known, as a paradigm. The paradigm, your worldview, shapes the methodology or the approach you take. Now broadly, that's quantitative, qualitative or mixed methods. And that will shape the type of research design that you employ. So the research design is really the roadmap that you use, the actual, that specifies the methods and the tools that you're going to use to collect the data to inform your research question. So research designs inform the methods or the techniques that you use, and within that the instruments that are used to collect data as well. So what we're seeing here is it moves from quite an abstract idea to very concrete, pinned down, this is what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. I should say at this point that this perhaps presents these terms as being agreed on in the literature, but actually there's quite a wide range of discussion about what constitutes a paradigm. How is it different? Is it different from a worldview? Is it different from a philosophy? Some people will use the terms methodology and research design interchangeably, and so there's a whole range of debate, and there is some suggested reading at the end of this if you want to look more at these ideas of research concepts and what they are. But there is a fair amount of disagreement in the literature as to what these things all mean. So to get a sense of how quantitative methodologies, which is what I'm labelling quantitative approaches, how they differ from qualitative, I think we'll just look at some of the key sort of headings. So paradigms, the worldviews that tend to inform quantitative methodologies, are things like positivism and post-positivism. The research designs that tend to be associated with them are experimental, or quasi-experimental, quasi-experimental, but also some non-experimental comparison studies, for example, like cross-sectional surveys, those sorts of things. And you can have quantitative case studies, which is where you're using small, very small samples, sometimes an individual case, to explore an issue. The methods that tend to be used within quantitative approaches might be things like surveys or observation, and examples of instruments that are used are psychological tests or measures, or psychometric tests or measures. Some of the key terms that it's really important to become comfortable with are variables and measurement. So there's a specific language nomenclature that is used with quantitative methodologies, and it's really important to understand what those terms entail. So there is a document, a little glossary to help you with each of these terms on the page. So things like variables and measurement are key. So operationalizing what something is in very specific terms, identifying how you'll be able to measure it. The scientific method, which is based on kind of hypothetico-deductive reasoning, which is where you have a hypothesis, you set out with a controlled experiment, or as controlled as possible, to test whether there is support for that or not. Things like reliability and validity have very particular meanings within quantitative approaches. So reliability is to do with either the internal consistency of a measure, or of, for example, a measure, its ability to collect information that is consistent across time points, and so on. So something that is really consistent in its measurement. Validity is referring to the degree to which what you think you're measuring is actually the thing you're measuring. So how accurate your measurements of the concept, the construct you're interested in, how accurate they are. So it's about kind of getting as close to that objective reality as possible, broadly speaking. So there are also important things around falsifiability, which is where you have a theory that you can test. It can be falsified. It can be found to not work, or not work under certain circumstances, and then that allows you to develop your theory, enhance it, and make it more accurate and reliable. And then something called null hypothesis significance testing. Now we're going to pick this up in one of the later videos, so I won't go into too much detail here about that. But this is one of the approaches to deciding whether an event that has been observed is likely to have arisen essentially by chance or not, given a set of parameters you've specified. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's basically to try and help you to look at how likely an event is to have happened, and understand what that means then for the context that you're working in. There's also a core issue around replicability. So you will possibly have come across some of the replicability scandal in social psychology, for example, where there's a debate about the ability of contemporary research to mirror findings of previous research or other researchers, and the issues of what does that mean in terms of psychological constructs, but also our approach to exploring them, measuring them, and so on. But as I said, there's a document that will take you through what each of these terms means. So let's contrast that then with qualitative approaches. So in terms of paradigms, the worldviews that tend to inform qualitative research, they are things like interpretivism, constructionism, post-structuralism. So these tend to suggest that the world, rather than research reflecting an objective reality that we can just measure and record and interpret, as in positivism and post-positivism, these suggest that our experiences are shaped by our environment, and we shape our environment, and so psychological concepts are constructed, at least in part, by kind of social interaction. And so this challenges the idea of one observable objective truth then, for example. In terms of the research designs, these tend to be specified in slightly different ways to perhaps some of the quantitative research designs. And indeed, you'll find some people will talk about a semi-structured interview design, for example, as a research design. But I've looking here at some of the ones that are suggested as key research designs by Creswell and Clark. And they suggest that each of these kind of designs is associated with its own particular approach to data collection, to interpretation and reporting, and so on. So they classify these as designs. So that includes phenomenological, narrative or narrative inquiry, grounded theory, participatory action research, but also qualitative case studies. In terms of the methods then that might be employed to collect data, they may be things like interviews or focus groups, observation, document analysis. So at least qualitative methodologies try to use naturally occurring talk or behaviour or documents where possible to more accurately reflect the world that people inhabit. In terms of instruments for data collection, they might be things such as interview schedules or topic guides, and we'll touch on that in a little bit, and discussion materials that can help stimulate talk, for example, without an interviewer being present in some cases. So you can see that there's a different emphasis, different types of data that are associated with these approaches. And some of the key terms that are associated with qualitative research are around critical approaches, so explication, which is more about kind of explaining and developing a richer picture than measuring and predicting outcomes, for example. There's more of an emphasis on the role of interpretation in things like data collection and analysis. Perhaps there is obviously interpretation involved in quantitative approaches and data analysis, but it doesn't tend to be discussed in quite the same way. Theory generation, so particularly around things like grounded theory, where you're looking at developing a theory that's grounded in data that you've collected. So, and naturalistic, as I mentioned. Hermeneutics is about kind of meaning making, and discourse, these are things that people can draw on. So a discourse can refer to perhaps the way that someone understands and explains or makes sense of experiences, or how they are positioned in talk in terms of power. And so discourse is something that's really developing now, and we'll touch on some of this in a little bit. But reflexivity is a key concept in light of qualitative research, and I argue actually quantitative, but it doesn't tend to be applied in the same way. But this is where there are different forms of reflexivity, but it's where you essentially reflect on your role as the researcher in shaping the research. It can also be the impact, reflecting on the impact of the research on you as a researcher, so what you learned and how you change and adapt. And it's really key because it helps. A lot of qualitative approaches argue that you can't separate yourself from your experiences, and therefore you'll approach things like data analysis through a particular lens of those experiences. So exploring how that lens of experience may shape your approach to the research, the types of research questions, or how you analyse data is really important within qualitative approaches. And we tend to talk about quality assurance strategies, and what you'll find is that some qualitative researchers have moved away from using terms such as reliability and validity, which are very much associated with quantitative methods, towards different language that recognises the subjectivity of qualitative approaches. So moving towards things like trustworthiness. So can you see that someone's interpretation it makes sense from the data that they've used? Is it something that they have particular, what we call researcher blind spots, or analysis blind spots that your experience means that you weren't aware of? And there are different strategies to managing those potential issues. As I said, there's that document that you can look at that takes you through definitions for each of these. So to summarise then, you have research designs which are typically associated with quantitative or qualitative methods. Now there is a move towards untangling these in mixed methods research, but we'll look at that in a little bit. So the kinds of research designs that tend to be associated with quantitative, as I said, are experiments and quasi-experiments, non-experimental comparison studies, case studies, and observational designs. But actually, you can also have observational designs that are associated with qualitative research. So, for example, ethnography. So the qualitative research designs tend to be around narrative inquiry, case studies, grounded theory, phenomenological, participatory action research, and discourse analysis and discursive psychology designs. So these are things that are kind of developing in those areas. In terms of experiments, well, what is an experiment then? So an experiment is where you try and isolate cause and effect. You try and remove any other possible explanations for an observed relationship between variables. And so it's rigorously controlled. A true experiment, all factors are rigorously controlled. There is an emphasis on being in what we call a laboratory setting, so kind of quite an artificial setting potentially that's highly controlled. But the result of this means it can be high in what is called internal validity. So if you see a change in one variable, you've controlled for everything else and manipulated only one other variable, for example, then you can say actually that change probably occurred because of the manipulation that you made. So that's what we would say is a high internal validity. But as a result, it can lack ecological validity, which is where it's kind of more, is it relevant to everyday life? Is it reflective of everyday experience? And so some arguments are that the rigorously controlled nature of a true experiment actually means that that scenario is unlikely to be representative of the real world, and so there are issues there. You don't know if the mechanisms will behave in the same way in the real world, for example. So a quasi or a quasi experiment is one that tries to mimic the level of control, but it will lack some of the features, and this is usually because there are variables of interest that it isn't possible to manipulate directly. You can only observe as naturally occurring differences. For example, you can't manipulate gender You would look at the difference between perhaps males, females, other individuals, or cisgender, transgender, and so on. But you wouldn't manipulate that directly. So it lacks some of the control, really, of a true experiment. A benefit of that can be that it's more representative in some settings of the real world. But the downside is that there could be other factors that we can't or haven't controlled for that influence the findings we have found, the findings that we've generated. So that just gives you a brief taster. There's a link here to a paper where you can actually see a quasi experiment, and there's a link to the paper, and I'd recommend having a look at it, at least skimming over it, just to get a sense of how they rationalise the research, how they report the findings, and how they link their conclusions to their findings, just to get a sense of this in the literature. In terms of non-experimental comparison designs, the core ones are around kind of the cross-sectional research studies. They're quite common. I think there's been quite a lot recently around cross-sectional studies for people's experience of COVID-19, lockdown, those sorts of things. So it's where you take a screenshot across maybe several groups. It might be perhaps males, females, perhaps people from different ethnic backgrounds, and so on, but at one particular point in time. So it's very much a screenshot of what's happening, or a snapshot. A longitudinal design, it can take this kind of cross-sectional approach, but it will go across a period of time. So there are things like panel studies, cohort studies, and so some of the big, there's the Texas twin study, for example, that's followed twins across a long period of time and looked at a range of different factors, for example, personality, and how that's changed over time. There are also non-experimental comparison designs that are cross-cultural. This might be where you're looking at different kind of constructs and how they appear across different cultures or different ethnic groups, for example. And so these things can also, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, so you could have cross-cultural longitudinal designs and so on. There's an example article that takes you through one of these designs. Again, have a look at how they develop the rationale for the study and how they investigate the concepts they're interested in, how they report the results. And then you can reflect on that in terms of any differences perhaps with the conclusions that are drawn in relation to the quasi-experimental study on the previous slide. So I've looked at here observation and ethnography together, and I think because there is, in terms of research design, there can be quite an overlap in terms of quantitative and qualitative approaches. What's important is to recognise that you can have observational designs, which is where it's primarily concerned with the observational records of natural behaviour, or a method which is simply a technique for recording a dependent variable, which could be part of a different, a quasi-experimental or an experimental design. So it's important to unpick designs from methods from here. But observation the type of observation is influenced by whether it is participant observation, which, for example, is ethnographic research is participant observation, or non-participant observation, where the researcher sits outside of that naturally occurring behaviour that's being recorded. It can be disclosed or undisclosed, so there could be an element of deception to try and prevent the influence of a researcher's presence on behaviour, or it could be disclosed, and there are lots of ethical debates about undisclosed observation. It could be structured or unstructured, and structured, so the more structured it is, you may have a schedule, and you may have to look at observations at particular time intervals, for example, and record the number of observations, or or it could be quite unstructured and kind of some more discursive in a way, looking at that. And it can be controlled, where you bring someone into, for example, a laboratory environment, which would be more associated with quantitative methods, or it could be naturalistic, observing people in a natural setting, or perhaps how they interact online, for example, in naturally occurring talk. So there are a couple of examples here that take you through some observational studies. So I'd recommend have a look at those. Again, look at how they're designed, look at how they collect the data, and look at how they draw their conclusions. So if we come on to some of the qualitative research designs then, so narrative research designs or narrative inquiry tends to be chronological or story oriented. It's where you focus on an individual, you look at an issue they've experienced or a problem, and you look at it from multiple kind of sources from that individual. You look at a detailed account of it, and restorying is where you try and take the elements of the experience and put them back into a chronological order, and develop a story, a restorying of what's happened to get a sense of it. It's typically with individuals or small numbers of participants, and it's a growing area of research. And there's an example that's provided below, which is looking at narrative, taking a narrative research design approach to the tsunami that occurred in the Indian Ocean. So again, have a look at that. Look at how it's designed, how it communicates its findings, and the conclusions it draws. Case studies, as I said, they can be quantitative or qualitative. They tend to be different from a qualitative, for example, case study will tend to be different from narrative inquiry, in that it's not a focus on the individual's experience, it's on the issue that the individual presents with, that has been selected because they have experience of. So it's the issue itself that is the thing of interest. Again, you tend to collect data from multiple sources, but you might not put them into a chronological order. It depends on the research. The aim is really to develop a case description and to report case-based themes that can be useful in understanding the problem. It tends to be conducted with either one individual or a very small number of individuals, and it's looking mainly at a broad interpretation of what that case or those cases can help us understand about the issue, and in order to make some applied generalizations, so kind of for practice and so on. And so there's an example here with music therapy, Korean music therapy, using a qualitative case study approach that was published very recently. So I recommend having a look at that and particularly contrast that with the narrative inquiry approach and see how the two designs differ. One of the other core qualitative research designs is grounded theory. It's quite different in a way from a lot of other qualitative approaches. It seeks to generate a general explanation or a theory of a process or an action, or an experience, something that is shaped by data from a large number of participants. Initially, it was developed from a very realist perspective, so just taking the data, the text that was generated, for example, are on the surface level really of what the text is telling you, and taking that as a reflection of the workings of the individual. But in sort of, I think in the 90s, it started to develop with a constructionist strand as well. So realist approaches have kind of existed since the 1960s. The constructionist approach developed really in the 1990s with the work of Chalmers, and looking at how taking more of a social constructionist approach to understanding the experiences and how they're shaped, and generating explanations that account for that. So it aims to develop a theoretical model, which then will typically be given a visual representation to illustrate how all of the different categories within that model come together and kind of are interconnected. So there's an example here that you can look at in terms of psychological resilience using a grounded theory approach, and have a look at this one and look at the methods, and particularly around things like approach to data collection. And you'll notice that something that is very commonly talked about in qualitative research, something called theoretical sampling and saturation, those two terms, have become common across qualitative approaches in terms of providing a means of justifying sample size, but they developed primarily from grounded theory approaches to research. So phenomenological research designs. Now there are many different approaches within this, so I've simplified it somewhat. But it's the aim is to look at what participants have in common about an experience, to try and distill that, what they call the universal essence of the experience. So rather than generating the theory, you're trying to get at the heart of what that experience is, and you do that by looking at how people make meaning of their experiences, what they have in common with those experiences. There are two core approaches, although I said I've simplified this. There is transcendental, or sometimes called descriptive, phenomenological research designs, and interpretive. Transcendental approach tends to involve a design where the researcher, what is called, brackets their experiences, so tries to remove their experiences from their interpretation to look at describing other people's experience to provide an insight into that. Now there is you may be familiar with the term interpretive phenomenological analysis, and that is associated with the interpretive phenomenological research designs, and this is where there's an argument that even description of someone else's experiences will involve interpretation on the part of the researcher to some degree. And so rather than trying to bracket your interpretation, bracket your experiences, you embrace that. And this is where reflexivity really might play a slightly different role in the two types of research. But it's also looking at its phenomenological research designs are concerned with the experiences of participants as they are lived, how they are ascribed meaning in order to shed a light on an issue. And there's an example of a phenomenological study from counselling psychology. So have a look at how it goes about that process. Again, contrast this with some of the findings from perhaps quantitative research and see the kinds of different conclusions there, the things that the types of research questions they're asking, and how they go about answering them. Participatory action research is one again that is growing in popularity. Whereas the others may produce social change as part of the process, participatory action research, that is the aim of the process. It is to produce a social change that will improve the situation of particular communities. So it starts with a social problem, and it evolves with the researcher being an integral part of the research process, so can't be seen as standing outside of that. And also where researchers and participants come together and collaborate at all levels of the research, so emphasising that participants are active in the role of research and as stakeholders in the research. So its focus really is on identifying an approach that can help resolve a specific applied social problem. And so it might be slightly different emphasis from some of the other types of research, which is why I think Creswell and Plano-Clark argue that it should be considered as its own research design. And there's an example there of student voice and well-being of a participatory action research project with a link there as well. So the final kind of research design that we'll look at are the discourse analysis type designs. Now, it's very hard to actually bring these together to talk about them in one type of design. They are many. They are all nuanced. So, but broadly speaking, they represent research designs that have turned to language. So there's a phrase, turn to language, which is where we look at language not as just a gateway into cognitive processes, as taken on face value. That's what the person said, so that's what the experience was. It's looking at how language is a social performance, how it works to construct a person's perception of reality, and how people are stakeholders, that they are trying to achieve social objectives, particular goals, and how language allows them or inhibits them from doing that. So what it argues is that you can't take someone's discursive performance, their text, out of the context in which it occurs, because they're inextricably linked. They're important to recognise the context in which these discursive performances occur. So these negotiations of power and so on. There are two core strands. There's discursive psychology, and then there's Foucauldian discourse analysis. So discursive psychology tends to look at how negotiation occurs, the meaning in everyday interactions and context. So how does language shape the way that people experience the world, and so on. FDA takes a slightly different approach, although I think Potter, for example, argued that there's far more in common between the two approaches than differences, and actually to do good discourse research, discursive research, we need to combine the two. But broadly speaking, FDA looks at what kinds of objects and subjects are constructed through the way people talk, the discourses, these things that people can draw on, and what impact does that have on ways of being for people? What resources does it make available, or kind of deprive someone of? And so it has a slightly different focus, but they're both really trying to understand the role of language and power, and performance and interaction. So there's an interesting study, an example here with a link to one of the author's home pages on ResearchGate with a paper, and it's looking at kind of talking about terrorism and applying some of these approaches. So that takes you through some of the core research designs. Now, these are things that you may encounter more in in the rest of the module, in your masters. Some may be more relevance to you than others, but it's important to be aware that research is vital to psychology, but the kinds of research questions you ask will affect how you can approach them and the answers that you can provide. So this gives you an idea of how these different types of research design can provide different kinds of insights into psychological phenomena. So just very quickly then, we've talked about some of the methods or the techniques of data collection. Now, one of the core things that a lot of people will have done might be a survey, which is where you have perhaps a battery of questionnaires, for example, to collect information. So it might be within a cross-sectional design. But although that tends to be associated with quantitative research methodologies, Brown and Clark, in their book 2013, provide a really interesting chapter, part of that section on qualitative surveys and the ways that they can be used to collect sensitive information. And they provide some examples and some of the strengths to that approach and the pitfalls and so on. And quite a lot of surveys actually will try and combine quantitative and qualitative questions in there. So observational methods, We've talked about some of those, but it involves recording of behaviour, and it can be either structured or unstructured. So structured, you'll have a schedule and you fill it out, that sort of thing. Interviews, again, it could be quantitative focused. So a structured interview is essentially a questionnaire that is administered by an interviewer, and there are quite a lot of examples of when that's done. So something like the Crime Survey for England and Wales will use an interviewer to explore people's experience of criminal victimisation, because it's a very complex survey. It collects a vast amount of data for the government and the ONS, and so it will have, at least part of it is interview assisted, so it's essentially a questionnaire that is read out by the and recorded by an interviewer. Or you can go in the opposite direction, which is very unstructured, where it's qualitative. Sometimes people call that qualitative interviewing, or in-depth interviewing, and that might be where you're using a topic guide more than a schedule, and I'll mention that on the next slide. But it could be also that interviews are one-to-one. It could be that they are focus groups, and actually there's some approaches that kind of somewhere between observation and interview, where you have discussion materials and you allow a pair of individuals, for example, who already know each other, to discuss the topic, record their responses without the presence of an interviewer, and then try and analyse that data. And there's some of the work of Anderson and Doherty looking at the use of information in blaming victims of sexual violence, for example. That would be an example of that. And I'm mentioning here the analytical strategies. So one of the arguments that mixed methods research, for example, makes is that methods and methodologies, methods and research designs, they can all be unpicked from each other. And so actually the methods and techniques that might be used will also be shaped by the analytical strategies you intend to apply. So they're all interwoven. So analytical strategies might be things like inferential statistical analysis. That will influence the type of data that you can collect, so how you collect it. But it may also be that you're planning to do something like IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis. Again, that will affect the types of interview techniques you use. They tend to be more unstructured, in-depth, a little bit more led by the participant, for example. So analytical strategies will play a role in choosing methods as well. So I briefly mentioned instruments or tools before. I mentioned something called psychometrics. So psychometrics is the study of kind of psychological tests and measures, and making sure that they are reliable, valid, looking at things like standardization, that they are able to differentiate between individuals that they should differentiate between. There's also something, for example, norming, where you can look at an individual's response and look at how they would fall within a typical distribution of responses on that questionnaire. So, for example, IQ tests, those sorts of things are normed. There are many different approaches to measuring attitudes in questionnaires. So there are different attitudinal response option scales, so things like the semantic differential scale, Likert scale, those sorts of things. And there are things like projective tests. And so I've provided an example of a database of free-to-use personality measures that are psychometric or psychological measures that have differing degrees of reliability and validity evidence, and some have norming evidence, for example. And that's on the IPIP page here, which is the International Personality Item Pool. In terms of then for more qualitative instruments, probably be looking at things like interview schedules or topic guides versus discussion materials. And we've mentioned some of those previously. So a topic guide is one where it's more unstructured. So there are a range of topics that you want to cover in the interview, but you will tend to use maybe some example questions and then prompts, and you'll go somewhat with how the participant talks about them. So you may not approach them in a particular order. You'll want to kind of encourage the participant to talk about the experiences and not inhibit them by sticking to a rigid schedule as such. So they are slightly different things. There are some examples of different types of data collection tools that have been used by Brown and Clark in their 2013 book, and I provided a link there to their supplementary information page, which is really useful to have a look at. So I've talked a little bit about qualitative and quantitative approaches, which tend to be the biggest division in research. But there is something which has been emerging in recent years, and is gaining kind of acceptance and in the literature, and that is the third paradigm, which is mixed methods. So there is an issue that has previously that because of the different worldviews that quantitative and qualitative approaches are really based on or associated with, there's been an argument that the two are mutually exclusive. There is no way to combine the two that would be meaningful because of the different things they assert about the nature of reality and how you can go about studying reality. But actually the third paradigm, mixed methods, researchers argue that isn't necessarily the case. So there are other types of perhaps philosophical position that can underpin the merging of these two quantitative and qualitative approaches. Those are things like pragmatism, critical realism, dialectical pluralism, and even Q methodology, which is, some people argue is just a method, but others argue it's a whole worldview in itself. And these assert to differing degrees that there is an objective reality out there, but also an subjective reality experienced by the individual, and that leads to something called the intersubjective, which is produced through the interactions between an individual and their environment and others. And so there are different kinds of reality that different types of approaches, quantitative and qualitative, can provide insight to. And so some people will argue that actually mixing, it's not just about mixing the methods, the techniques, like surveys, for example. It's not just about mixing those, it's about mixing the methodologies, the worldviews themselves. And in part that might be because they can help to minimize the limitations of one approach. So for example, quantitative data tends to provide insight into prediction and patterns, but might be lacking in an understanding of what that experience really is like, and the opposite is true for, say, qualitative approaches. So there's an argument that actually the two can minimize each other's limitations, but authors such as Johnson and Onwuebusi argue that actually it's about beyond minimization. It's about something called the radical middle, where juxtaposing these different approaches to understanding the world provides fresh insights that you just wouldn't have if you didn't mix the two together. And so this is really where that third paradigm, that third worldview is evolving. There's also an argument, I've provided a paper here which talks about the Q methodology. As I said, some people consider it more as a research design or a method, but actually others are arguing it's a whole worldview in itself and how it can be applied to both qualitative and quantitative research approaches. So there are some exciting times, I think, for mixed methods research to come. Whenever we're thinking or talking about research in psychology, it's vital to remember that there are ethical issues with all research. Some may be more severe than others, but it's important to understand that those ethical issues, how they can be managed, will affect the types of research design that you employ, the methods you use and the instruments you use to collect data. These things are all interwoven, and so it's vital to remember that. And thinking about the context that the research is conducted in as well can change whether something is quite risky or not. So, for example, issues around involuntary participation, for example, for research looking at personality disorder with uh, offenders in prison, those sorts of things. It can be quite different from looking at a community sample, for example. So it's just to bear that in mind, and when you're thinking about doing your own research, that you can't think about research design without thinking about ethics. So to wrap up, hopefully you've got a sense of the role of research in psychology and in the kinds of answers it can provide to questions, how it can help us to choose between approaches, whether that's in research and therapeutic approaches or so on. Hopefully you're more familiar with some of the key concepts relating to psychological research, and there is that document, the glossary, that's on this page as well, just to help you. And hopefully you've got a sense of now the difference between when we talk about quantitative and qualitative approaches, what those sorts of things mean, so you can unpack some of those terms and what that divide is. So here are some links to some useful publications that are looking at things like research design and approaches to research. Once you have your university login, there are many other books in the Hive, in the library, some e-books which would also be of benefit reading, but this will hopefully just get you started with some of those key ideas and key concepts in psychological research. So I hope that's been useful. Please complete the quick 5 multiple choice question quiz on this part of the module page, and once you've done that, then the next mini lecture will appear, which is around introducing descriptive statistics in psychological research. Okay, thank you.